A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
$13.5 trillion. That is a number that almost loses its meaning because of how massive it is. To put it in perspective, that is larger than the gross domestic product of every single nation on Earth except for the United States and China. It is more than the combined economies of Japan, Germany, India, and the United Kingdom. And yet, this mountain of capital sits in a relatively quiet, often overlooked corner of the global economy, managed by a handful of state-owned entities. Today's prompt from Daniel is about sovereign wealth funds. And it is a fascinating, perhaps even chilling look at how these massive piles of money are shifting from passive, boring savings accounts into active, and sometimes highly controversial, tools of geopolitical influence.
It is the ultimate follow the money story, Corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been digging into the data on this because the landscape has changed fundamentally in just the last few years. We used to think of these funds as rainy day accounts for oil states, a way to make sure the kids and grandkids had something left when the wells ran dry. But as of early 26, they have become the most powerful players in the boardroom. When a fund like Norway's government pension fund Global moves even a fraction of a percent of its portfolio, it sends shockwaves through entire sectors. We're talking about a hidden economy that effectively dictates the terms of global geopolitics without a single vote ever being cast by the public.
I think we should start with the basics for a second, because even for people who follow finance, the distinction between a sovereign wealth fund and, say, a central bank reserve can be a bit blurry. Daniel's prompt asks us to define what they are and why they exist. From what I've gathered, the central bank is about liquidity and currency stability. They're the ones making sure the ATM works and the inflation rate stays under control. But the sovereign wealth fund is about long-term wealth accumulation. Is that the right way to frame it?
That is exactly the core distinction. A central bank needs to keep its money in very liquid, very safe assets like short-term treasury bills because they might need to defend the currency tomorrow morning. They are the firefighters. A sovereign wealth fund, on the other hand, is the long-term estate planner. They have a much longer horizon. They are investing for the next generation, or in the case of some of the Gulf states, they are investing for the day the world stops buying fossil fuels. The capital usually comes from a few specific sources. You have the commodity funds, like the ones in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or Abu Dhabi, which are seeded by oil and gas revenues. Then you have the non-commodity funds, like those in China or Singapore, which are built from massive trade surpluses and foreign exchange reserves that exceed what the central bank actually needs for stability.
So it is essentially a national savings account that is allowed to take risks. But Daniel also asks if every country has one. I would imagine the answer is no, because you actually need a surplus to start one. You cannot really have a sovereign wealth fund if you are running a massive deficit and have no natural resources to export, right?
You hit the nail on the head. To have a sovereign wealth fund, you need excess capital. Most countries are actually in the opposite position. They are struggling with national debt and trying to attract investment rather than figure out where to park $13 trillion. This is why these funds are concentrated in two types of economies. You have the petrostates, which we mentioned, and then you have the export powerhouses like Singapore with Temasek and GIC. If a country is spending every dollar it makes just to keep the lights on and service its debt, it does not have the luxury of creating a fund for the year 2050. It is a club for the wealthy, and that club is getting smaller and more powerful every year.
It creates this interesting divide in global power where a small number of nations hold the mortgage on the rest of the world. But let's look at how they actually use that power. The prompt mentions typical investment strategies. Traditionally, I think of these funds as being very conservative, buying up blue-chip stocks or prime real estate in London and New York. But it sounds like that has shifted towards something much more aggressive.
The shift has been dramatic, Corn. If you look at the model pioneered by Singapore's GIC and Temasek, they moved away from being passive index trackers a long time ago. They are now massive players in private equity, venture capital, and direct infrastructure projects. They are not just buying shares of Apple, they are funding the next Apple before it even goes public. We are seeing funds like the Saudi Public Investment Fund, or PIF, taking massive stakes in everything from electric vehicle startups to professional sports leagues and gaming companies. They are looking for alpha, or higher returns, because they have the one thing most investors lack, which is an infinite time horizon. They do not care about the next quarter, they care about the next 30 years.
And that long-term horizon allows them to be the anchor investors in massive tech shifts. I have noticed a lot of these funds moving heavily into green energy and artificial intelligence infrastructure. It is almost like they are trying to buy a seat at the table for the next industrial revolution. But this brings us to the more contentious part of Daniel's prompt, which is the recent wave of divestments from Israel. This is where the quiet world of finance gets very loud and very political.
This is a critical development because it challenges the fundamental idea of how these funds are supposed to operate. There is a set of guidelines called the Santiago Principles, established in 2008 in the wake of the global financial crisis. There are 24 of them, and they are essentially a voluntary code of conduct meant to ensure that sovereign wealth funds make decisions based on economic and financial considerations, not political ones. The idea was to reassure the West that these funds weren't Trojan horses for foreign governments. But in April 2024, we saw the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund divest nearly €3 million from 6 Israeli companies, including Bank Hapoalim and Bank Leumi. They claimed it was because of activities in the West Bank, but from a fiduciary perspective, it is a very slippery slope.
It feels like a massive contradiction. If the goal is to maximize returns for the citizens of Ireland or Norway, but you start excluding entire sectors or nations based on the shifting winds of geopolitical sentiment, are you actually fulfilling your duty? And it is only accelerated recently. We have seen reports from February 2026 that Norges Bank Investment Management, which manages that $1.7 trillion Norwegian fund, is under intense pressure from its own Council on Ethics to review its Israeli holdings.
The February report was quite pointed. They are looking at defense contractors and Israeli firms through the lens of their ethical guidelines regarding human rights in conflict zones. And then, just a few weeks ago on March 12, 2026, a coalition of Nordic pension funds signaled they were reviewing Israeli sovereign debt. This is a significant escalation, Korn. It is one thing to sell shares in a private bank. It is another thing entirely to signal that you might stop buying a nation's government bonds. That is a direct attempt to influence a sovereign state's ability to finance itself. It is the financial equivalent of a diplomatic blockade.
I want to dig into that for a second because it connects to what we discussed back in episode 1009 about financial decapitation. When you use these massive pools of capital as a geopolitical lever, you are effectively turning the global financial system into a battlefield. For a country like Israel, which has a highly advanced economy and deep ties to global markets, these divestments are clearly intended to be a form of soft power warfare. But who is actually making these decisions? Because that leads to the democratic deficit Daniel mentioned.
That is the part that should worry every citizen in a country with a sovereign wealth fund. Take Norway as an example. The fund belongs to the people of Norway. It is their collective wealth. But the decisions about which countries are ethical enough to invest in are made by a small council on ethics and the board of the central bank. Do the average people in Oslo or Bergen actually agree with using their retirement savings to make a statement about Middle Eastern geopolitics? Or is this a case of an unelected bureaucratic elite using the nation's checkbook to pursue their own ideological agenda? There is no referendum on these divestments. There is no public debate in the parliament about whether Bank Leumi is a good investment or an ethical one. It happens behind closed doors.
It is a classic agency problem. The managers are the agents, and the citizens are the principals. But the principals have almost no visibility into the process. Most people probably do not even realize their national fund is the largest shareholder in half the companies they buy products from. I think about Nikolai Tangen, the CEO of the Norwegian Fund. He has been very vocal about transparency and ESG standards, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. But ESG has become this catch-all bucket that allows funds to justify almost any political decision under the guise of risk management.
The argument they use is that political instability or human rights concerns represent a long-term financial risk to the investment. They say they are not being political, they are being prudent. But when you look at the consistency of how these standards are applied, it falls apart. These same funds often hold massive positions in countries with horrific human rights records that just happen to be strategically aligned with their interests or are too big to divest from without hurting their bottom line. It feels less like a principled stand and more like selective activism. If you divest from Israel but keep your money in other authoritarian regimes because they provide your energy security, the ethical argument starts to look very thin.
And then you have the other side of the coin, which is the sportswashing or soft power acquisitions we see from funds like the Saudi PIF or the Qatar Investment Authority. When the PIF buys a Premier League team like Newcastle United or starts a new golf league like LIV Golf, they are using their sovereign wealth to change the global conversation about their country. It is the same mechanism, just a different goal. Instead of divestment as a punishment, it is investment as a charm offensive. Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the governor of the PIF, is now one of the most powerful men in global sports and finance. He's using that $800 or $900 billion to ensure Saudi Arabia is indispensable to the global elite.
It is a brilliant strategy if you are the one holding the money. They are buying influence, access, and a degree of immunity. If you are a major Western bank or a massive tech company, you cannot afford to offend the people who might write you a $10 billion check for your next funding round. This creates a massive power imbalance where these state-owned funds can dictate terms to private industry. We are seeing a move away from the neutral, rules-based order of the Santiago Principles toward a world where capital is explicitly weaponized or used for statecraft. The PIF's Vision 2030 is a perfect example of this. It is using a sovereign wealth fund to literally rebuild an entire nation's economy and global image from the ground up.
I wonder how this affects the average investor or listener. If these massive funds are moving in a coordinated way, it changes the valuation of everything. If the Nordic coalition decides that Israeli tech is a no-go zone, it does not just affect the companies, it affects the thousands of people employed by them and the global supply chain. It feels like we are seeing the end of the era of neutral investing. You have to pick a side because the world's largest pools of capital have already picked theirs.
The risk for the funds themselves is that they might eventually lose their welcome in the markets they are trying to influence. If a sovereign wealth fund is seen as a Trojan horse for a foreign government's political agenda, you start seeing countries passing laws to restrict that investment. We have seen some of this with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFI-US, which scrutinizes foreign deals for national security risks. But when the investment is coming from a friendly nation like Norway or Ireland, the scrutiny is much lower, even if the intent is to use that money to force a change in foreign policy. It is a very messy intersection of high finance and low politics.
I think back to our conversation in episode 1162 about the Irish Settlements Bill. That was a diplomatic breakdown, but this divestment by the Irish Strategic Investment Fund is the financial version of that same conflict. It is about trying to isolate a nation through economic means when the diplomatic means have failed. But the scale here is just so much larger. 3 million euros from Ireland is a drop in the bucket, but if the Norwegian fund follows suit with its $1.7 trillion, that is a different galaxy of pressure.
The irony is that Israel's economy is incredibly resilient and has its own deep pools of capital and innovation. But the signal it sends to other investors is what matters. In finance, there is a herd mentality. If the world's largest sovereign wealth fund says a certain type of investment is unethical, other institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies often follow suit to avoid being the next target of activists. It creates a domino effect that has nothing to do with the actual value of the companies being sold. It is about social and political contagion.
So, for someone listening who might be thinking, what does this have to do with me? I think the takeaway is that your own retirement account or your own pension is likely tied up in this web. If you live in a country with one of these funds, or even if you just have a 401k that invests in global indices, you are part of this ecosystem. These funds are the market. When they decide to play politics, they are doing it with the collective future of their citizens.
And that brings us back to the question of accountability. If the Santiago principles are effectively dead and these funds are becoming instruments of the state, then we need to treat them like any other government department. They need oversight, they need debate, and their mandates need to be clearly defined by the people whose money they are actually spending. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim to be a neutral commercial actor when it is convenient, and then act as a geopolitical enforcer when the wind blows a certain way. The democratic deficit is the most dangerous part of this $13.5 trillion story.
It feels like the era of the quiet, boring sovereign wealth fund is over. We are moving into a period where every investment decision is scrutinized for its political alignment. What I find particularly interesting is the March 12th signal from the Nordic pension funds regarding Israeli sovereign debt. That is a direct challenge to the idea of sovereign immunity in finance. If you can be blacklisted for your defense policy, then no country's debt is truly safe from political shifts.
It is a massive precedent to set. Imagine if funds started divesting from United States treasuries because they disagreed with American border policy or military interventions. The entire global financial architecture is built on the idea that government debt is the risk-free rate. If you introduce political risk into that equation, you are adding a layer of volatility that the world is not prepared for. It could lead to a fragmentation of the global economy where you have different blocks of capital that only invest within their own ideological circles. We are talking about the end of globalized finance as we know it.
That sounds like a recipe for a much less efficient and much more dangerous world. But it seems to be the direction we are headed. The $13.5 trillion is no longer just sitting there. It is being put to work. And whether it is for sportswashing or for political divestment, the goal is the same: influence. We are moving from a world of trade to a world of leverage.
It really is the new frontier of statecraft. For the listeners, I think it is worth looking into who manages your national wealth. If you are in Ireland, look at the ISIF. If you are in Norway, look at NBIM. If you are in the US, look at the various state pension funds that often follow these same trends. The transparency that Nikolai Tangin and others talk about is great, but transparency without accountability is just a front row seat to a show you did not buy a ticket for. You can see what they are doing, but you can't stop them.
That is a great way to put it. We are watching this massive shift in real time, and the consequences for places like Israel are just the beginning. It is a tool that, once refined, can be used against almost anyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive, you might want to check out episode 1302, where we looked at the legal labyrinth of the disputed territories, which provides a lot of the context for why these funds are targeting certain Israeli banks in the first place.
It definitely fills in the other half of the picture. The financial side is just the latest chapter in a much longer story. I am going to keep a close eye on the results of that Norwegian ethical review as we get later into 26, because that will be the real bellwether for where this is going. If the world's largest fund decides to fully exit a developed market like Israel, the rules of the game have changed forever.
Well, I think we have covered the landscape pretty thoroughly. It is a lot to digest, but the sheer scale of the money involved means we cannot afford to look away. Thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process all this data.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these explorations valuable, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who are looking for this kind of depth.
We will be back soon with another prompt.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where